Hi, and welcome to the Root To CISO Podcast. It's me, Kris Rides. I'm going to be your host, and I'm going to be chatting to seasoned Chief Information Security Officers about their career journeys. We're going to be unencrypting their real-life stories and searching for the hidden keys to help you fast-track your cybersecurity career. Okay, so welcome everybody to the Root To CISO Podcast. I'm really excited today to have Jason Woloz with me, who is somebody I've known since 2012 when I very first started the company. It's one of the first people I met in security. And he's the reason why we have a Cloud Security Alliance LA chapter. It was SoCal chapter at the time, but there was originally the first president, hosted everybody. I think I turned up for the second meeting and basically put my hand up and said, I'm not a practitioner, but I'm happy to help with whatever you need. And all of a sudden found myself as a director looking after social media for the SoCal chapter of the Cloud Security Alliance. And that was, like 12 years ago now. So it's a long time. So I'm really excited to have you on board. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I can remember, I think we were maybe 3 people in a room. The other ones might have been, my team might have been like Abe or somebody else. But yeah, it was like 3 of us in a room. It was, that was a fun time just getting started. Exactly. There are thousands of people in that now, I think, right? So
that's amazing. Well, it's now LA, Orange County, and San Diego. So they have all 3 chapters split out now. So yeah, they've got a huge membership. I think it started with a few of us. Basically, everybody in that room became a director. They all become a founding director. If you were in that room, then you were pulled into helping us get off the ground, which was brilliant. Good times. Well, I'd love you to sort of give everybody an introduction. Obviously, we know each other very well, but I'm sure throughout this conversation, I'm probably going to learn new things because we don't really talk about all of this sort of stuff, even when you know people for a long time, right?
Yeah, well, I can give you a little bit about what I'm doing right now. So I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Early Life Sciences. We're a digital health company that spun out of Google X about 8 years ago. We focus on using technology and our understanding of problems in health to give customers better health outcomes, essentially. We have a variety of businesses, and they range from software to hardware to insurance even. And it's been a great ride. I've been here for just coming up on about 4 years. And I came from the Google family where I was at for about 7 years before that.
Yeah, looking after the Android stuff, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure, because I'm sure that was a lot of fun and very interesting to be involved in. What was your foundation before you even got into security?
I started off as more of a self-taught engineer. I actually went to college for religion, East Asian studies. I went to a liberal arts school, so not exactly your typical path. And about my senior year, I realized that was probably not going to be the best path for me. And around 2000, because they had the .com crash and a couple other things happened. It was sort of tough times to find a gig, and so I got really excited about technology. I'd always loved science. And I decided, I met a couple of mathematicians and folks that were in the comp sci teams. Comp sci classes at the school, and I built my first Linux machine and built my first computer, and it was kind of downhill from there. I just got really excited about it, and actually got a few internships, and my first job out of school was a software engineer at a company in the financial world, focused on content management, for example, and web programming. It was pretty new at the time. Mm-hmm. So this was a company that I was at where they were still doing DB2 and COBOL and a lot of older technologies. And I sort of became a bit of like a knowledge leader in that space, just because I was at a point in my life where I was so hungry to learn everything, and I just was consuming so much information and going to all these meetups and things. So, there was very little security for the first 2 to 3 years of my working life.
And then how did that end up going into security, or how did security sort of start getting involved in that side of things?
I started taking classes at NYU at the time. There were actually a few people. There was a bit of a hacker community in New York, which is still there today. They have 2,600 folks came from Long Island, I believe, or that was at least where it was published. And they have a conference called HOPE. I believe it's every 2 years. I think I went to HOPE one year and learned about these classes at NYU, and I started taking classes with folks who are really luminaries in their field. But at the time, security wasn't as much of a priority outside of federal government or the inner workings of a bank. And I got really excited about learning how to defend and break into Windows servers at the time. So I took a bunch of those classes, and then I learned, I think to be really good at this, I probably need a stronger foundation in computer science. And so I took a program at Columbia, and I did that at night for a couple of years until I finished that with a certificate and a degree. And afterwards, I realized I really still liked all of this, and I wanted to dig deeper into it. So I heard about the Fellowship of Service Program, which is a program that still goes on today, and I've always been a big proponent of. It is a way for you to get a part of your undergraduate or part of your graduate degree paid for by the U.S. government. I believe it's sponsored by the National Science Foundation and maybe the Department of Defense. And they will they'll pay for the degree, and they give you a stipend. And the classes, are generally, or the degrees now it's like 15, 20 years later, they're all focused on different topics in cyber, not just pen testing or forensics, but also management and policy, et cetera. And I got into the program at NYU, and it was, the next 2+ years of my life. And then, from there, I did some internships, and we could talk more about that, but career sort of, continued from there.
So were you committed as part of that? Are you committed to then going into the government and working for the government for a period of time? Is that, because I know in the UK, they have some similar sort of programs where part of your degree is paid, but your commitment is when you come out, you go and work for the firm or the part of the government that paid for it.
Yeah, exactly. There wasn't one part of the government that paid for it in this case. I think I don't exactly know how the budget works, but you were at the time allowed to work for a government agency, or I believe a federally funded research lab. So think about like a Los Alamos or, one of those, what's another one? I think out in Stony Brook, I think there's one in New York. There's quite a few of the labs there. Over the last decade or so, I think they've changed the rules now, and you can work for, I believe you can work for like a MITRE, you can work for RAND, other groups that are affiliated. But generally it has to be, you're giving back to the government by ideally sticking around and, being a government employee, or very worst case, you're becoming part of this community of security professionals that, there was never enough of, right? I'm sure you can attest to.
Yeah.
You got to choose essentially, or you got to interview, and then whichever one wanted to work with you was, where you would go and work for two years or however long your service lasted.
Nice. Yeah, it's interesting. So a lot of the stuff I'm involved in with like NSITE is National Science Foundation funded. So I see a lot of their grants. They're still doing a lot of great things in our industry. I don't know how many people actually know about what they do, but there's certainly a lot of different things they're involved in. I personally would love to get more involved with trying to create these entry level roles. Not because that's where we as a business make our money, but just because if we're going to place the people of the future in 2, 3, 4, 5 years time, we need them coming through. And the gap that I see is not enough people being given those first opportunities. So I think we've got enough people coming through from degrees and people that are coming from alternative paths and are passionate about security and putting themselves through training, but there doesn't seem to be enough internships. In fact, we're recording this today on a Friday. I'll do a post at some point today. I always try and post one internship on LinkedIn every week, just to sort of highlight that people are doing these things. How did you find your internships?
Well, one of them was actually the time barnesandnoble.com, which I have not checked in with recently, but it's still there as far as I can tell. That was a really good introduction to just a modern.com that used real technology. I think historically when you were in graduate school, it was really hard to get licenses. Like you couldn't get an Oracle license, you couldn't get a Cisco license, because it was just too expensive. So unless the school had, some kind of special program going on. So it was really nice to just test out products. I think at the time, like we were messing with Nessus, now Tenable, and a variety of things that, some of which still endure today. So that one I got through, I think, a friend of NYU, from the program, not my friend, but I think a friend of the program.
Yeah.
And then I did another internship at the Air Force. And so I think that came through the Scholarship for Service. They sort of exposed these opportunities. That was upstate Rome, New York. So that one was definitely through the scholarship network. And I had a third internship, but that third internship was probably through nepotism or somebody had made it through the family. So I think the takeaway there is have great networks, know great people, and they can help you. And if you can prove to them you know what you're talking about. So not one way or another. But yeah,
no, that's good. These are the things. And we're going back really far back into sort of your pre-career, really. But these are the conversations that most people don't get to have. And actually, some things have changed a lot, but an awful lot of stuff hasn't. And knowing people and networking and if you're in a college, who does your college know? How are they assisting things? I went to a conference and I was the MC for it over in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, CIAD, and it was all faculty, and they were talking about different industries and we talked about sort of creating those relationships and how colleges, especially community colleges in that aspect, could make more of those. And I think there's a lot that colleges can do. There's a lot that companies can do. And I think the government could probably do even more of these. They're desperate for people. And if they can create more of the entry level roles and get people a little bit earlier, that will hugely help our industry to make sure we don't have this huge gap as people retire and move off to do other things. So yeah, I think that's an interesting one. So you moved into cyber. Where did you get your first dedicated cyber role?
So I worked for the Department of Defense. It was my first job out of grad school. So I would say that I did a little bit of security towards the end of my first job as a software engineer, but it was more incorporated into what I was already doing. I would say, you're trying to understand how service-oriented architecture worked and XML at the time. And SAML was just becoming a thing in identity space. But I would say the first formal job as a security engineer, and that was my title, was with the Department of Defense.
And so that was kind of through what you did originally through the school, right? And having that service opportunity. Yeah, I'd love to see more of that. I don't know actually a lot about how much the government's doing now on those sort of things, but I think those are the ideal ones. If you can give people coming out of college and let them know that they're guaranteed to get that first job and a first opportunity, we'd probably see even more people wanting to come through it. So I think that'd be good. Now, then there's different aspects. When I speak to people in our industry about the challenges that they have through their career, there's lots of different aspects. And one of the first is getting into it, which we've sort of discussed how you've done. The next step is making that move from sort of an individual contributor up to becoming a leader, whether it's a team leader or a manager. When did you first get that opportunity and how did that come about?
I think the first thing, if we take leadership to mean beyond managing people, and we talk about it in terms of like thought leadership or being like a knowledge leader, if you will, or terminology you want to use, I probably started to do that a bit at my first job, right? Because I happened to be a person who just was, like I said, hungry for information, and a lot of other folks just weren't really schooled up on those technologies yet. So I think that was probably the first place, with just wanting to get involved more with strategy and strategic decisions, which then opens up a whole other world, right? Because you've seen what it takes. You've seen at the very other end of strategy, but you're not necessarily looking at the, where that begins. And those sometimes can take years to unfold. So I think that was probably the first in my first job. And then interestingly, when I was at DoD, I worked a lot on research. And so, not all of those things necessarily led to, something practical that you would see out in the world. In our case, it did, but it was more, more other knowledge share that you could pass around. It wasn't, we didn't necessarily write some software or something like that. I would say that at the end of my first job and then the beginning of my gig at DoD, I started to manage people, mostly contractors though, or vendors, and not colleagues. I didn't really manage colleagues until probably my third job. And I think that was a really good introduction to it. And not to make that differentiation, but I mean, for those folks who are getting, new into their career, you don't typically provide direct feedback, for example, to a performance review on a contractor or a vendor. You may give, vendor feedback, obviously, but you don't always have an impact on someone's career. And I think there's a big difference between managing, people that are colleagues in the company versus folks that are hired for a specific purpose, or for, a temporary relationship, or for a project. So, and I think that came through, an opportunity, which was, again, sort of being the person who was really excited about certain topics and wanting to connect the dots with what I saw as strategies happening in the Department of Defense. And by doing so, I was able to bring on people to help with that and focus them on projects.
As you're talking there about it, you kind of hit the nail on the head. And in some of these other podcasts, we've definitely talked about sort of being a leader and being seen as a leader. But that we should be speaking about thought leadership, because that's where it comes from. Ultimately, if you want to be seen as, if you're going to be seen, whether you want to be seen or not as a leader, once you start doing things that people are interested in, and once you start pushing the boundaries of maybe the work you're doing or the technical area you're in, people will start talking to you about it and asking you about it. And that's how you probably just almost fall into having an element of leadership already at that stage. So that's a really good point I've not really thought about, because when I talk about leadership and careers, I think most people think about, right, I've now become a manager and I'm no longer hands-on, but very few leaders actually, that's not like a line in the sand, right? It takes time to, like, many people that are managers are still hands-on, and it's not quite as all right, and now I've made it and now I haven't. It's constant sort of little bit here and there, and you gradually, all of a sudden, probably look at yourself and say, oh wow, I'm actually not doing as much hands-on work anymore, and I'm now managing people, rather than it being a sudden I've made it thing. And that's what it sounds like you're describing in your career.
Yeah, I think it was very incremental. I mean, I started to see my path unfolding as, what I wanted to be was a knowledge broker to some extent. And that meant, trying to fill in the gaps of different technologies and verticals, and, that, I hadn't really ever experienced, or maybe I read about in a book and I needed exposure to that and experience with it. And, one of the ways I did that in the very early part of my career is I decided, well, if I could just bring everyone together and we could come up with a bunch of topics that we ourselves wanted to work through and understand better and problem solve, and I could be a problem solver, then, folks would certainly want to talk to me more, but also I would start to centralize knowledge and get other people to sort of be bringing knowledge to me rather than me having to go out and find it. So I actually put together a conference. It was an internal conference to the government, and it was a way for me to get various agencies to share information, and we had a lot of speakers, both internal and external folks. And it was, on complicated topics that nobody else was really, able to solve for at the time. So, when in doubt, look for the path of least resistance to being able to be a person that people want to come to because you have maybe the answers, or you can connect them with folks who may have the answers, right? So kind of classic, like networking type of approach.
Yeah, I still think I've basically made a career of connecting people. Like that's my job. I always say I don't think I'm never the cleverest person in the room, and not like, I guess I'm self-depreciating there, but it's true, right? I'm not the cleverest, but I know the cleverest person, and so like that's at least useful, right? If somebody needs an answer to something, I'll know a little bit. I know a little bit about everything, and then enough to know then probably who you need to speak to get the rest. So yeah, guess that's me covering my career. Now, what you also did something else. You talked about, obviously you were in the DoD for a couple of years there. How did you make the move across to commercial? Because there's a lot of people that find that a real challenge, moving out of government and into commercial. So how did you do that?
The first thing I did was I actually left being a government employee, and I became a contractor. So I worked at Booz Allen at the time. And I think that was a really good way to see a much broader set of problem sets, just because the nature of consulting is the opportunity to help on projects of varying sizes and time, durations. So that was the first thing I did. And I actually met my future boss there. She was a rising star at the company. And when she left to go work at in healthcare, or it was pharmaceuticals actually, I asked, is there an opportunity there? And she brought me on, and that completely pivoted my career. So this was a person who I would say was a mentor at the time, and I still look back fondly on as being helpful in my career. So I think the combination, that's sort of one, transition and pivot through consulting, and then secondly, getting into a verticalized business, which I wouldn't say had similarities with DoD, but because it was regulated, I could bring some of the regulated experience I had to that, and that was a helpful transition, right? So like I understood it wasn't a breakneck technology process in most cases that we were looking at. So very different than, say, if your transition was to a startup, right, or to a small software development shop or something like that. Yeah,
the move is, when I look at, like, for instance, do you know the NIST NICE? The way the NIST works with the NICE descriptions of jobs, and so the companies that are using that tend to be the more bureaucratic, closer to the government style companies. So maybe highly regulated, insurance, healthcare, banking, finance. Those tend to be the ones that are still utilizing those the NICE framework. Then you get to the commercial companies, which are more like startups and other things, and they're not using it at all. So it's I guess that would make sense to be a smoother transition to come through from government to a contractor that can share a little bit more than just government projects. You might end up working on a few more commercial ones, and then eventually into probably like you say, a more highly regulated area that has to, maybe they're using NIST framework and they have a bit more regulatory stuff that's similar. So that's sensible. Then what was the sort of steps from there until you got your first sort of CISO position or head of security?
Right. So if we sort of look backwards in terms of on the timeline, I start off by being more of a hands-on software engineer, and then I move over to being more of a security engineer, starting to become, interested more in management and strategy. And that was actually what I did as a consultant. I started to work more with the offices of the CTO and the CIO. And so that was an opportunity to sort of just see how things can unfold over a period of time. Also, just much larger budgets than I would ever have direct access to at the time. And I started to then say, well, I want to get a better sense of overall how an enterprise, uses technology. And so in pharmaceuticals, I was working in solutions and enterprise architecture types of projects, really large scale. I needed to understand like what is the actual technology folks are using. I mentioned like before, like the Oracles, the SAPs, Concur, like these large systems in these, multi-100,000 person companies, because you can't really protect something you don't entirely understand. So that's how I started the transition. And then at that point I said, well, I would really like, I think I have the basis for being a chief security officer now, right? So I've done the hands-on stuff myself. I've got the graduate degree. I know what it means to be a software engineer, and so I can empathize and understand their plight. And then I know what it takes to implement these things in large scale. So, I could do that, right? I mean, or I thought I could, right? And and I didn't know what I was getting into exactly at the time. And that's how I transitioned to it. So sort of shoot for the stars kind of opportunity.
When did you what was your first CISO position?
So it was at Cornerstone on Demand. That was 2011, I want to say. Is that right?
Yeah, we met 2012 at Cornerstone.
Right. So, okay. Sorry. Yeah. So a couple of years earlier than that. And I had left Pfizer, and I wanted to go across country with my wife, who was going to business school. And I got introduced to the CTO by a friend who was doing really well there. And she couldn't say anything, she could only say good things about the company. And so got an introduction and had some interviews on the road and had a couple final interviews in person once I got to California. And then I became the head of security and CISO there. I ran security, privacy, and compliance for a couple of years. But it was, through connecting with others, right? And also saying, and also like looking back and saying, well, how do I frame the previous experience to explain why I'm good for this position, right? So I think that takes also a bit of care, right? Thinking about looking back and saying, okay, well, what do I want to do? And then, how is what I've already experienced, set right for this?
And do you, like, the networking part is so important. Like you talked to, having the career move by like basically having a great relationship with your previous boss who pretty much took you somewhere. And I see that a lot of that happening. And then this one, again, somebody introduced you and gave you that opportunity. Like the networking side, I can't underestimate enough. And I think the sort of audience we're going to have here is if it matches the people that come to the panels that we've had at ISC2 and InfoSec World and all of the other ones, then it's going to be a real mix. So it's going to be that mix of people trying to get into the industry, people that are trying to make the move from an individual contributor up, people that maybe haven't had that CISO title and they're finding the challenge to get up to that. And the one thing that's consistent is this networking and how much easier it is to get a role through doing that than anything else. Now, I feel like with you, it's been really natural because everything I know about you, you've just got this thirst for knowledge and that attracts other people, and you want to know about other people. You want to know what other people are doing. Is there anything you've consciously done to work on your network?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'd be lying if I said that the whole thing, going after Cloud Security Alliance, I'd be lying if that wasn't a way for me to build a network. So I don't know how new you were to Los Angeles at the time, but I certainly was very new, right? I know you.
I was 2 months when I met you. I'd only been there a couple of months.
Right, because I knew we overlapped in other parts of the world that we lived in, but right. So I mean, I knew nobody, right? And I don't know. I would say at the time, I there was no Silicon Beach. You had a couple of companies there, right? You had certainly a lot going on down by the Air Force, right? That was pretty significant. And security companies, I remember Rapid7 was there, for example, at the time. There's other tech companies. You had the Match Group and Open Table and those kinds of organizations that were there. But it wasn't really a technology town, right? That would happen after I left. And I needed to find people to share ideas with. I certainly didn't know all the answers, and there was no IRC chat that I was necessarily in that I think could give me all the answers either. So my goal there was, one, how did we define more standards, templates, things that I could selfishly use, and then how could I use other people to help me do that without having to hire consultants to do it, right? If you wanted to have a unified controls matrix at the time, you would have been paying a consulting agency hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they would have told you it was impossible. Here comes Cloud Security Alliance with their unified controls matrix, and great, I use it to this day to some extent, and just that approach. So, big thank you to that group of people. I think they were, and they're still, same people are still there, I believe, right?
Yeah.
You're still working with those folks. I think that was definitely intentional. And then one of the other things I did to build a network, and this is going back a little bit, is I wanted to learn a little bit more about attack and defend. And so I had started a capture the flag competition in graduate school. It was NYU's first. The first year was a little bit of a mess. I had great people with me who did everything possibly good to make it work. But I remember the way that we approached it is we weren't going to build our own. We didn't know enough. We'd never done one before. We hadn't gone to. I think most people hadn't gone to DEF CON, and even if they hadn't experienced their famous CTF. And so reached out to the people at TorCon, which I believe is a Southern California conference. And I think the person's handle was Little Wolf. He just gave us the code, and we were able to leverage it. And, we obviously couldn't port it over exactly. We had to make changes, but right there, we made friendships and relationships, and we ran this CTF, and we had people from, as far down as Brazil who were involved. And a lot of things broke, and it was awful and a lot of fun and extremely nerve-wracking. But I mean, that was a great way to build a network, just trying something new that there wasn't a ton of people doing at the time. And, I have some, I still have some relationships that came out of that years later. So, you can do it in school. You don't have to always make these networks as a professional, I think is my point and all of that. And I'm in some really amazing networks right now. ISLF, CSO Council, SVCI. I mean, these are some of the best security professionals in the industry, privacy professionals as well, compliance folks. So, if it were not for them, I don't think I would be where I am today. I think they've been an amazing group of people that I rely on all the time. And I'm just so thankful for having met them. So, that's been really, beneficial and lucky that I got to that place.
We are lucky that I feel like the industry we're in, once you're in, you really are in. People, once they know that you're not, okay, I'm in here for the short haul, I'm just in here to earn a buck, or, once they know you're passionate about the industry and you care about it, our industry's really like, I do get around you and support you. And that's one thing I really love about it. I love about being in the security industry. I think it's a challenge to get through and knock on the door, and because there's so many people trying it. But once you're in, you're in. And yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have a business, right, if it wasn't for the network and the people around. And I think there's an awful lot of people like yourself that probably wouldn't have had the careers they would have without the amazing people that are out there, and everybody. And that's why I think you give back, even, and I know you talk about the CSA, being an element of selfish, I needed to get this out of it, but you still give back for a number of years and still put together a lot of people. I think at that time, LA actually wasn't really high tech. We didn't have the Silicon Beach, but what we did have was all the media and entertainment, and they had so many years of experience of data loss, right, of losing films, of having to protect them. And although it's a slightly different area of security, they understood it and they were moving to the cloud. And I think, we brought in a lot of people from media and entertainment that got involved in it, and I think that helped the community. And then gradually we saw all of the NorCal people moving down and opening offices and stuff. So yeah, it's nice that we've got such a great network and industry. There's so many good people in it, but also I think well done to you for bringing people together and still being part and involved in it. Like only today, I know you've introduced me to a couple of people, so I appreciate that, mate. I always do. Now, I'm just trying to think. It's been a kind of tough sort of 18 months for a lot of people. Some of them have been laid off, and there's a lot of high tech companies that hired heavily and then now have let people go. And so I speak to a lot of people that are not realizing, they're constantly looking for a new role, but they're looking for the new role to be a promotion on what they were doing before, rather than taking maybe a side step or even a backward step. And I'm a believer that when you're not working, you might be okay for a period of time, but at some point you don't want to be looking for a job when you absolutely have to have one. That's not the ideal, because then you're forced into decisions and working places that perhaps don't align to what your your goals are. So in your career, like, has there ever been a time where you've had to take a step backwards or a sideward step that then's led to sort of a much greater outcome?
Yeah, so I think that when I left Cornerstone and I went to Google, I decided, sort of going along the same path of, hey, I really need, the way I see my career is, if I fill in these gaps, I can be more effective as a leader, because technology is always changing. And at the time, privacy was an emerging area of focus. Certainly the US has doesn't have the same kind of regulation, has more so now as Europe does, other parts of the world, modulo what's happened in California and a couple of individual states, in the states that have laws. And I really wanted to understand that, both, technologies that people were thinking about implementing, policy and strategy. So I started off purely focused on privacy from being a CISO, which was really great because it brought me back to my roots and just sort of focusing in somewhere and digging really deep. And did that for a little while. And I don't think it was so much that it was a sidestep as much as, it was more of just a way to spend almost like a focused sabbatical almost, right, in this area. And certainly it was a lot of work. It was learning a lot of new things and being in a place where this was being defined, right? This whole area that we now focus on with like privacy engineering and didn't really exist then, right? Now you have all these companies that do it. So I think that was an interesting sidestep. And then, after a couple of years, I went back to, my roots again as more of a security focused professional, which is how I landed at Android and Play. And there was some privacy components there, certainly. But I wasn't as much the focus of my attention, I think, then as it was in the previous job.
Right. It's not, and this is something that's come up consistently, your career ladder, it's never a straight line, right? I always say it's probably a bit more like snakes and ladders, which is, that you may well have to come down, you may slip down a couple of rungs, right? And in your journey, and to be accepting of that, but then also to understand that sometimes you'll make a change because, like you wanted to build some skills in another area. There was a gap that you saw, and that gave you an opportunity. And I think people need to be very open-minded in that respect, because once some people become a CISO, that's it, right? I'm not going to take another job unless it's another CISO role. This is what I need. I need to have this title, and like titles in our and hopefully you'll share your experience with this. But in my experience, titles really don't mean anything. I can't tell what people do from a title because there's so many different CISOs out there that are doing completely different jobs from each other. So I don't know how you feel about that and what you've seen, but that's been my vision of it.
Yeah, I think you have to take into account the size of the company they're working in, the life cycle that the company is in. Being the CISO or head of security, or security and trust, if you will, of a 15 or 50 or sub 100 company to doing that in a 100,000 person company are worlds apart, right? In terms of what their focused on what their day-to-day life looks like, right? Um, and, you know, I think it takes a little bit of, more than just like reading a resume. It probably takes a bit of talking to that person and understanding where they're coming from, what experiences they're having. Oftentimes you also are seeing these days that people who own security in smaller companies are also owning technology to some extent. I've seen that a little bit more too. So how much of that time is mostly corporate network or corporate and enterprise versus working on the product itself, right? So a lot of folks could be, more focused in one area and almost never be involved in the development of the product itself, right? So like I've certainly seen that. So I don't think titles necessarily reflect exactly what people do on a day-to-day basis, or how hard they're working, or how hands-on and technical they are, or policy oriented. And you only can figure that out, I think, by sort of having them explain what experience they've had, what kind of cross-functional work they've done, how they've scaled certain processes or new technology, how much coverage they have. So I would agree with that. It's not something you could just read in print and then get an understanding of what someone's doing.
Yeah, I guess that's what makes it. Again, probably would struggle to have a company if it was so easy that you could just match job titles to everybody. I don't think that you'd need to use a third-party recruiter ever if that's all we needed to do. And I know in some industries it's a little bit easier. Certainly prior to Tyro, I was doing sort of general IT recruitment, and there were some aspects of that that were much more simpler, right? This is what this person did. Great. If I search for that job title, I'm going to find somebody really easily, speak to them and put them forward. Whereas then I end up having a conversation to a lot of security engineers or, security architects about what they're doing. And, that doesn't always match up to what our clients are after. Now, is there been, when you look back on your whole career, were there any sort of major turning points or any sort of really big lessons that you learned that made a sort of a huge difference that you think would be worth sharing on here?
I mean, I think graduate school was certainly important. I got to spend 2 years doing nothing else except focusing on things like writing secure operating systems and doing forensics and we had I remember this one time, and I was reminiscing about this the other day with one of my friends from school. Was we bought a bunch of machines, silicon graphics machines from a government agency, and we drove them back in my old car and probably destroyed the shocks and the brakes. And we just did forensics on them, and we found some stuff, and we told them what we found. I mean, that was really great in the sense of camaraderie and like this idea of sort of hacker spaces and just trying stuff out, right? I think that was a really amazing point. In grad school also, like the capture the flag, as I mentioned, and then I think in the DoD, putting together this conference was just a great way to sort of understand what it takes to do to make change and to inform, and also to learn that not everybody is in the same place as you, right? From in terms of their education on certain topics or their career, and how they come at things and how they understand. And I think that was extremely important for me as well. Just being able to look at that from a top-down view. I would say Cornerstone is really interesting because there was a lot going on. And even though it wasn't necessarily technically a startup at the time that I was there, it definitely had a lot of that flavor. And I think for anybody who's trying to break in or, wants to, break into the field, not break into computers, given the topic, but, or just wants to get as much exposure to different things as possible. Like, you couldn't ask for really a better experience than that, right? I mean, I had to do a bunch of compliance standards in a very compressed period of time, which taught me a lot. I had to understand technologies, hire people, and then also learn how to sort of share responsibilities with other teams like SecOps and DevOps, which to this day is still a thing, right? You always have you're always going to have a little bit of friction or trying to find your way with IT and engineering. And I think that was really important, right? To see how things can go badly at times and make sure you never get there. And I think I take that with me to this day. Like, I'm always trying to make sure that we're working as effectively as possible. I think the last would just be, I worked in a few really large organizations that if you weren't good at marketing yourself, or I don't just mean yourself personally, but your function and your team, people either could forget about them or just think they it's almost like commoditized. They don't even think about it. It just sort of happens on its own. And I think it was really important to make sure that security was in front of people's minds. There's a cliche of, it's everybody's problem. That's certainly true. And, but I also don't think you want people to think about it as a problem or something they have to think about. It's just, oh yeah, I need to talk to the, the security team, or I need to talk to the privacy engineering team or the compliance team. And if you don't do that, I think you're always going to find that your staff feels like they're having to re-explain themselves a lot or re-educate people. So I think there's something to be said for making sure that everybody knows what you do and why you're there, and also the struggles, right? Why it's not easy, and why they can't just always say just blanket yes, and there's not, always it depends, because, there's a lot of complexity. I was explaining to someone the other day, I mean, these days the role of the chief security officer has changed, right? I mean, now we see people can be fined, right? And potentially have, charges against them, mm-hmm. right? And that's certainly scary, but I mean, I think that's yet another reason to say, hey, we put yourself in my position, right? It helps give people empathy, right? To understand like where they're coming from. And not that is necessarily going to be the common case for most, but it's just, hey, this is a possibility. We all carry risk now, right? And a different kind of risk than other people in other roles in the company might have. So I think those are the things that have really stood out and made the biggest impact on me, and I take them into account every day, every planning cycle.
Yeah, I feel like all of the bits and pieces you've described there, well, it probably follows on to the question that I know I've asked you before about CISOs and their attributes and those that are doing a great job. But I think a lot of the things you described there are things that people need to know to make that move up to being a CISO. There's a whole bunch of stuff I wanted to ask you about anyway. I think with Cornerstone, were they public at that point, or did they go public while you were there? Because I know they went public at one point, right?
Just before, literally just before I got there, they went public. Yeah.
And were you their first CISO?
Yeah.
Because we've helped a few companies that they've hired, either just before they go public or just afterwards. They quickly sort of, right, okay, we realize we need a CISO. We've got an awful lot of different regulatory things we need to meet. And so most of the ones that get involved at that stage, there's a lot to do. Very quick learning curve.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is also when you now have a bunch of money and you want to grow, because that's what the market expects. You're going to be going after, I think, certain customer base that you weren't going after before. And those more mature organizations expect that you have people in these kinds of roles, or they have to have them, right? They maybe their vendor, third-party risk program doesn't allow them to work with a vendor unless they have people in these roles or have mature programs. So it becomes, required, right, before they can even contract with you. So I think, I think that can often be the case. And certainly, if you're working with U.S. government, I mean, they oftentimes want to see a very strong security program as one example of that.
Yeah. The big push for CMMC at the moment is, like, we're starting to see quite a lot of assessments, requests and gap assessments for that. Because I think it's January, the CMMC becomes sort of set in, and then people are risking losing their government contracts or their DoD contracts. So could cost a lot of small businesses quite a lot of money. I mean, either way, it's going to cost you a lot of money. It's going to either cost you a lot of money making sure that you're in line with everything you need to be doing, or it's going to cost you the whole contract that you've got when you don't do it. So rock and a hard place, I suppose, for CMMC at the moment. Anyway, I did sort of hint at it, but that some of the things you described are similar to some of the attributes that I think are important. I want to know what the sort of top 3 attributes that you think a CISO needs to be successful.
I mean, I think one of them is, it's not necessarily patience as much as it is not being reactive. So if there's an incident going on, and you're involved, I mean, certainly, you need a cool head and you need to be patient and be thinking about that. And this is someone who's done a lot of incidents at this point. I would say that, but not being reactive, just because somebody asks you or is pushing you to do something, or it's coming from like a business team, it may not be the right thing. And I think you sometimes need a little bit of time to think about it and process it. So I think that that's pretty important, because what I find is when you're reactive, then you find yourself you've signed up to a bunch of different attestations you need to do, or certifications, whatever. Or, you've made a very short-term decision on a product feature, whereas you could use that as an opportunity to maybe, look a little bit bigger scope, right? And try to affect a broader set of features down the road. So I think that's one of them. So somewhere between, that's somewhere between, I think, patience and not being like super reactive, right? So you can also stick with your roadmap. And I would say, like, this, I don't know who invented this term, but I like it, is like just knowing the hill to die on.
Right.
I think people can take things really personally, and they can assume that something is something that somebody wants or is claiming needs to be done is a reflection on them. And I think you need to not take those things if you want to survive and not stress yourself. I think you have to not take them personally, but also determine, okay, is this really the thing I have to fight for? Is this the thing that is so important to risk management or to the program that I'm willing to use my political capital? Because you only have so much of it, right? I mean, you kind of keep re-upping it, like I think, to some extent, like kind of like a video game, but that it's not continuous, right? You have to kind of, or it's not unlimited, I should say. So I think knowing the hill to die on, right? Deciding what are the big things that you're willing to say absolutely not, or it's going to take this and this to make that happen. I think that's pretty important too, because I've seen some people really burn out because, or they've, lost trust, right, from others because, they fight really hard on everything. That's not to say you shouldn't care and be passionate, and there are important things, but I don't know if everything is always critical to this, to the safety of the overall program and the business objectives. And then sort of along those same lines, or by extension, just really good prioritization and communication. You really, one, not everybody comes from the same place as you, whether that's personally as you grew up or how you're educated, but also they don't necessarily understand why something is really important. And, if it's a board you need to speak to, or if it's an executive you need to speak to, or if it's just a new engineer, right, or someone in marketing or legal, like anything, right, they all have different things that they're focused on, and security is not always number one to them, or they just haven't experienced enough that they can totally appreciate where you're what your perspective is. So I think that's really important. I think, if you want to be successful, like treat every opportunity as like a learning opportunity, teachable moment when it makes sense. And try to very much bring things down to planet Earth for people, make it realistic. Like, what is an anecdote that they can associate it with in their own life that they've experienced, right? Not everything is as obvious as like phishing attacks and things where we experience that on a regular basis, but trying to help people understand why something matters. Sometimes you have to take a little bit of extra time to explain it.
Yeah,
I think those are the three critical areas.
Yeah, I think that kind of what you're describing at the end is almost empathy, like being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, because that's the key I see with security, is that, and that's why you get the reputation of like the office of the no, right, and just being there saying no to everything, when instead of sitting there and, like you say, taking the time to actually get to know the person and getting to understand why it's so important for their job to have access to this and what the alternatives are, so that you can come up with something that isn't as risky, or maybe is a solution that works for everybody, right? And make sure that they communicate to them why it's important and why you can't just say yes. That level of empathy, I thing continually comes through and probably weaves its way quite nicely into business, and understanding that, you know, by doing that, you're understanding the business better. You're understanding what that person's motivations are. And if you understand somebody's motivations, you then know how to sell your product, which is security, to them. So that's interesting. I love the thought idea of a CISO video game. like using up knowing where to use your energy on certain tasks, and where to keep hold of it. Is there anything you've done on any of those three things? Is there anything you've consciously done, whether it's courses or any tools that you use that have helped you sort of be better at that?
You know, maybe so on patience. I mean, I would say that I've learned more to be more thoughtful about like well-being, and you know, focusing more on like meditation and just sort of, you know, being quiet, not always having to fill the space, and just sort of you know, watching certain things unfold on their own without trying to necessarily insert yourself. So I mean, some of that has just come with maybe with age, or with you know focusing on that, you know, some of those new recent philosophies. And then, you know, the others, I think certainly has been by watching other non-security functions and how they've worked in large organizations. I don't necessarily know if there was a course. I mean, I've certainly been benefited over the years from taking courses around more like managing people, and taking courses like 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, or Crucial Conversations, you know, or reading, you know, Harvard used to have these like little books on that I would buy about, you know, how to do certain kind of problem solving. I that's probably the closest. I mean, there's been a lot of those over the years, understanding what quadrant somebody is in when they're speaking to you about a problem or in their career, that I can't necessarily go back and name. But, you know,
are there any CISOs that you think are doing a really fantastic job now, and you kind of either look up to or see them and have followed their career?
You know, I mean, I don't know if I don't know necessarily if they're active CISOs that I would say that for. I mean, I think there's a few people that I certainly respect what they're doing, and one security professional I've always really appreciated was Michael Zalewski, who had worked at Google for a bit, and then he was a long time. Then he was at Snap. I'm not sure what he's doing now, but I really loved his books. And even today, I think he seems to be focused on other kinds of risks in the world, not necessarily always about cyber, but I always find that he's got a really interesting perspective. Ross Anderson, right, who passed away recently, was somebody I respected a lot. I found really, really, loved his security engineering. Never got to take a class with him, but I mean, I thought it was really good. People that I think have done a really nice job of just showing the dynamism of some folks. I mean, like Caleb Sema right now has just spent a lot of time trying to understand the artificial intelligence, machine learning space. And I watched him go from temporary break to, becoming an expert on this topic and speaking a lot about it. And, I think, that's been really fun to watch. But there's really a lot of people who are, probably are unsung heroes in their own way, or you don't know what they're doing in the background. They've done amazing things when it comes to state actors that they've had to protect against, or large scale fraud. And I work with lots of those people all the time in those networks I mentioned earlier. But I don't know if I would put out somebody by name there.
Yeah, no, I get that, mate. That makes sense. You're right. There's probably a lot of people that are out there working on different things that you get to have conversations with or meet, and it's impressive. Right? It's impressive to hear what they're doing, and maybe exciting as well. You've always got that hunger for knowledge. I always love speaking to you because you're always up to something interesting. Traveling here, blowing glass, whatever it might be. There's always something. You're in that tinker tribe, right? There's always something that you're up to, and I always love that because it's always something that I find like really interesting. It's not something I've never normally done, so I always like sort of picking your brains and hearing what you're up to. So that's yeah, I love that. Now you've got, I guess if you could go back to yourself, a lot of these things come with wisdom, and you talked about that, the wisdom and the time that goes along. If you went back to your really early career self and could give one piece of advice, what would that be?
I think just like love the mission, right? You know, because you'll then come back to it. It sounds like something that people just sort of say flippantly. You know, you should join a company because you love the mission, or you should be in something because you love the mission. But I think there's some truth to that, because then you have something to hold on to. And there was a period where I was really not excited about cyber anymore for a variety of reasons, and it came back, and I just, you know, I don't have any reason to leave it, right? I mean, it's just, so I think that was it. Sort of stick with it. That's one, and then maybe just have a roadmap, have a plan. You know, I said earlier you shouldn't be reactive, but if you see security or this field of risk management as something where you have to sort of flutter around like a butterfly and constantly, you know, address something that's falling on the floor, catching on fire, I think, you know, I would take a step back and look at the situation from objectively and see if you're doing it right. So I think, you know, those are probably the two things that I think of that are pretty important to being successful there.
Yeah, I suppose in a job where you can get pulled from pillar to post and there's always the next urgent thing, if you've always got a plan to fall back on, it helps give you some sort of structure, or at least a feeling of control. Well, out of interest, what made you fall back in love with security?
I think it felt very tangible for me, and maybe I was getting a little bit too much exposure to the wild world of large corporate IT, and it felt like there was more business folks involved in that than I felt like I could make a difference in. And I just felt like that was one thing. I think the other thing was that it's never ending, right? I mean, in the same way that, you know, technology is always advancing, but there's always a threat of some kind, right? I mean, you can decide which one you want to make important, you know, put importance behind it, but there's always something that you have to kind of, you know, worry about.
Last question. This has been really interesting. I've definitely learned a few things that I didn't know about you already, and hopefully it's been useful for everybody else in the audience to see sort of how your career's been. You've been a hiring manager for a very long time. For those out there that are trying to stand out from a sea of applications, because right now, if you put an advert out, we're seeing like hundreds of applications. Many of them are just using the easy apply button. So they're not necessarily a great fit for everything, but they're just trying to play the numbers game. And if you want to stand out, what are the things that you think like candidates can do to really stand out and put themselves above everybody else that's out there, you know, trying to get a certain role?
So I think there was a time, and it was, how many certifications did you have, and did you work for, you know, a big name company, or did you go to a certain set of schools? It's certainly not as important now, as people have found that, you know, having a 4-year education does not necessarily make you a good security professional, or, you know, let alone going to, you know, maybe a top tier school, or necessarily having worked at, you know, a big name. I think what's important to me, and it obviously all depends on what you're looking for, is, you know, tailoring your resume so that you focus on not every single thing you've ever done, but the things that matter for the job, right? I mean, that can come through in the interview, right? I mean, if it turns out you had pen testing experience, but this job is for, you know, being a GRC analyst, like that could be really useful, but that may not be what I'm hiring for. So like all you're doing is adding more words up front, and I'm not really going to get to that information in the time that, you know, I'm going to be clouded with all these other things. I'm going to just very quickly make a decision like, well, this person doesn't seem like they're the right fit because of experience. I would say also put your most important stuff higher up, right? either whether like the first couple of bullets, or such. And if you need to do a skills-based resume instead of an experience-based resume, I think about putting the most important things forward as well. More junior people or people who are trying to break into other fields, if you can show that you've made a concerted effort to try to do that through internships or certain kinds of projects, I think that will differentiate you as well. And what are your networks? What have you done? Have you spoken at conferences? They don't have to be big ones. You don't have to speak at DEF CON or Black Hat. I mean, they could be, you could speak at smaller conferences, but I think the important point is like, you know how to teach people, you like digging into topics and getting your hands dirty. I think those stand out to me, right? You have good networks as a result of that. If you've done that enough, I think though, and assuming that it's legitimate content, I'm actually going to go and look at it ideally if I can. I think that will help you stand out. If you're not a person who's doing exactly what you want to be doing in your next job, but in your side projects or in your non-day job life, you are speaking on these topics, like that's great. I think that's impressive and can be. Yeah.
Yeah. I like how you've broken it down there, because if you think about it, usually the first way you're introduced to somebody is the resume. And what we always say, like, take your time, don't send out a generic resume, write the resume for the actual job you're going for, and bring out you're going to have so much experience that you can talk about, but talk about the ones that are relevant for the job, because otherwise, as you say, very easy for that information to get lost in a bump of everything else that's in there. And so taking the time to do that has always been successful. And then, like, we met through networking, we met through a chapter event. The chapters have always been really welcoming of letting people talk there for the first time and giving them the opportunity to do that. So talking just at your local chapter events can very quickly lead to you talking at the local conferences, and then your local conferences are then your B-side conferences. And a lot of the conferences are run, especially the big ones, are run by people that also run smaller conferences as well. So it's funny how quickly you can find yourself. Like, if I think about me, probably publicly talked about things at CSA events, right? And then people that were at the CSA events would run the ISSA or ShellCon or B-sides. And then they were like, oh, Kris, would you come and talk about that there? Yeah, sure. And then I found myself more comfortable with doing that. And then the same people that were organizing those would introduce me to people. And next thing you know, I've spoken at DEF CON, and I've spoken at RSA a few times, in InfoSec world. And it's all that our community is so small that you can start with those little chapter meetings, and all of a sudden, a couple of years later, and you're speaking at some of the biggest conferences in the world, and scratching your head thinking, why the hell is this happening? And who wants to listen to me? But yeah, it's a great way to stand out.
Yeah, I remember even, I had this distinct memory of going to, and it might have been Symantec or one of the offices that was in LA, and they would host OWASP. Somebody was hosting OWASP. I don't remember which company it was.
It was Symantec. It was, yeah.
Symantec? Okay. And people just like, local folks who were doing sometimes not security jobs, but in more corporate IT or in more foundations, like developer operations or SRE type of work, and they would come and talk on a topic, and it was a safe space, and people were generally wanted to hear what you were doing, because and they'd walk up to you afterwards and ask you for some pointers, or did you write any code, or is there anything, is there a GitHub repo, or is there an open source product that we can do work on together. So I think there's nothing truer than that. Just putting yourself out there a little bit, and just making sure that you find the right community, I think will make you more successful. I can tell you right now that even people that I went to school with 15 years ago are some really very successful entrepreneurs or very successful executives that I'm just proud to know. And a lot of that came from having, good networks, I believe.
Yeah, 100%. Like I said, I'm I'm not very, very successful. I have a small business that's been successful enough to pay my mortgage for the last 12 years, right? And it's all come from really that networking and connecting people. So yeah, it's not bad. I can't complain. I can't agree any more than with you than that. Thank you so much, Jason. I really appreciate you giving up your time to do this, especially as I know you're on vacation at the moment. So especially more so because you've found somewhere to do it while you're away and spent an hour and a half chatting to me about work, basically.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I'm happy to do it. Excited to do it. I love when you decided that you were going to start doing this podcast, and I look forward to all the great people you're going to talk to going forward. I hope I'm the first of many.
Thank you for listening to the Root to CISO podcast. If there's something you really want me to ask on the next episode, or if you're a CISO who wants to inspire the next generation, please reach out. I'll leave a URL to my LinkedIn profile and make sure you connect and message me there. We're always looking for feedback, so please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.